Welcome to Baseline to Baseline, a Middle Border Conference basketball podcast. I'm Jordan Lehman, as always, joined by Jeremy Negra. What's happening?
What's up? Not a whole lot. Just another Thursday night in Wisconsin.
Yeah. And this is a Thursday free of BW basketball, both boys and girls, with the night off. And so we're going to, like we normally do, talk some NBC hoops. How many games have most girls teams played by now? Is it like four or five?
I mean, yeah, it depends on their non-conference schedule, but everybody's played 2 conference games. And so there's teams that have played as many as 6, but as few as 4.
Yeah. So I've watched exclusively, well, not exclusively, because I've watched 2 BWs played, but watched BW beat Somerset, and you've watched them a couple other times, correct?
Yeah, I obviously watched them play at Amory, and then the game they played earlier this week was a non-conference game against New Richmond, and that's actually the second time I've seen New Richmond because I went and watched their opener against Central as well. So as far as teams outside of that, haven't really done that yet, just because we've been down the road with other things. So the current standings in the Middle Border for girls, 3 teams tied at 2-0: Altoona, Baldwin Woodville, and Ellsworth. 3 teams tied at 0-2: Amory, St. Croix Central, and Somerset. And then the 2 teams in the middle at 1-1 are Prescott and Osceola.
Sure. And I'm looking at Ellsworth right now because BW will match up with Ellsworth tomorrow. That's Friday night at BWHS in Baldwin. And I don't know that their strength of schedule is terribly strong. Ellsworth, I'm speaking for, but they're still 4-1 overall. They do have a quality conference win. At least I would call it one against Somerset. I think Somerset, obviously, they're 0-2 in conference, but playing BW and playing Ellsworth, those are two formidable opponents. That with Ellsworth, Molly Janke and company have a real good shot to compete, like we talked about in the preview. Like 3 or 4 or 5 other teams do have a pretty good shot to compete, to win conference.
Right, and Molly Janke, I mean, she's averaging 22 and 12 right now. Which is pretty good, if you're into statistics. And like you mentioned, their strength of schedule hasn't been great. They were supposed to play New Richmond, but that game got postponed because of the Ellsworth football team. Beat Central pretty handily, close game against Somerset, and then most recently lost this week to River Falls. And River Falls has had a good win against Hudson as well. So I don't think you're wrong about the strength of schedule. I think there's a lot left to be seen, but being early with a lot of these teams, it's really hard to tell. They're not all in the same shape. I think the girls that are the teams that have girls that are predominantly maybe cross-country runners in the fall start off a little better than the teams that are predominantly volleyball players. And I think, the first thing that I want to do, is apologize. I think I didn't give Amory much of a shot this year. And I don't think they're going to, win the conference by any means, but going to Amory is never easy, and they have 3 varsity players that are freshmen. Their numbers are down, but they're a strong group of freshmen. And I think that goes a long way, not necessarily maybe this year, but over the course of the next 3 years, that's going to be a big deal. So they really give BW all they can handle last week. And whenever you win in the Amory gym, I feel like you feel like you escape that gym more so than anything else. Amory obviously is 0-2 in the conference, but they've played okay, and that's something that I think that bears some watching. They've had some rough years. Um, they've had some really good years, but they now have 2 wins overall, and I think they're a team that's maybe the trajectory is a little bit better than we anticipated right away going into the season. They only lost to Osceola by 11, and then it was 36-39 against the Hawks. So I think that they're on the right path anyway, even though they are 0-2 in the conference.
Yeah. It's interesting seeing, teams that are really being carried. Like you said, they have 3 freshmen. Even Ellsworth, like being led by a sophomore with 22 and 12. Like basketball is a funny sport that way. In the sense that it's very, very, very rare. Almost never happens that you see a good football team led by a freshman. Like it's very rare, just because physically it's hard to be at that level, right? And with physically oriented sports, like predominantly physically oriented, and basketball definitely is at times, but basketball skill, which is, can transcend that. And obviously, we talk about Molly Janke. She's most of the time going to be the tallest girl on the floor and probably one of the strongest as well. But yeah, it's definitely impressive what Amory's doing. I don't know that it'll translate to a ton of conference wins, because I think the conference is really tough. But I mean, they had BW on the ropes. They held Osceola to a good game. So it wouldn't surprise me if they knocked somebody off they probably weren't supposed to. And I don't know that St. Clair Central's in that realm. I think that St. Clair Central, and we'll talk more about the boys next, but kind of like the Amory version for the boys of the girls middle border conference, where it's going to be tough right now for them to compete, at a high level against good middle border teams, which is fine. And we talked about in the preview, it's not really like looking down and, looking down on them as a program. It's just the reality of where they're at, and on the flip side, near the top of the conference or at the top of the conference, I think that, Altoona, they lost to Rice Lake, but Rice Lake being a Big River school, like that can be to be expected, right? But I think that the
they
6-5,
they also lost to Elk Mound, and Elk Mound is really good.
Yeah, really good. But I mean, what's being proven, with their conference wins is I think that Alyssa Worth is the real deal when it comes to just her impact on the game. Like, she isn't not leading the conference in scoring by any means, but having a 6'5" presence inside is a really, really big deal.
Yeah, for sure. And that's hopefully only going to get better. Right now, she's averaging 13 and a half and 8.5 boards. And so I think there's probably some more in the tank, because I know she dealt with some stuff during volleyball. But the thing that you do early, right or wrong, is you look at kind of comparative scores to see, okay, well, we played them and they played this team, so how similar are they? And Elk Mound has now played 3 schools in the middle border. One of them obviously being Baldwin Woodville, which was early and a close game for about 8 minutes, and then not real close. They ended up winning that game by 16. They also beat Altoona by 16. So I think it's probably a fair that the BW game was at Elk Mound. The Altoona game actually is listed as a Colfax game, so I don't know if they had some neutral site tournament or something. But I think that's probably at this point and early we thought Baldwin Woodville, Altoona, Prescott, maybe Ellsworth, depending on how they progress. Somerset was a team that we held up there. Somerset lost to Ellsworth. Osceola was another team that we thought had a chance. And that's kind of what we've seen so far. So there are some 2-0 teams. And like you mentioned, the 6'5" girl for Altoona being a 13 and 8 player right now, if she can consistently do that, that's going to be a problem for a few more years. And with her being a sophomore, with Janke being a sophomore, um, it's almost like, wow, this is going to be a really good conference for a number of years. The thing about Alyssa Worth, according to With Sports, leading the team in scoring with a high of 19, 3 of 4 from three. And I think that could go one of two ways. Obviously it can be now we've added this weapon where I can pull you out and knock down a shot if I need to, which is a positive for both her and for the team. It can also be the opposite of that, where you have a girl that you want on the block because she's 6'5" and can do things, that says, wait a second, I'm great from the perimeter. And then she backs out there and starts taking more and isn't shooting at a 75% clip. You know what I mean? And so, if those numbers are accurate, and that's a thing that she can kind of add to her arsenal, like all post players, if they can shoot from the perimeter, it makes it harder to defend, right? But if it becomes something that you're like, I want to do that more, then that's not necessarily great. You not only do you take, for any post, not only do you take them out of their best element, but you now take a rebounder out of the area where she would clean up. So that to me is going to be the one to circle BW Altoona for now. But I think obviously Prescott's going to have some say in how that all turns out, as well as these other teams that are looking to knock off anybody on any given night.
Yeah. I think you talk about Prescott, talk about Osceola. Osceola obviously with one of the better players in the conference. I can't think of it, Fox. And Osceola's kind of, they've had some good wins. I think that like you said, winning at Amory is not an easy thing to do, regardless of the year. And they did that, and they scored quite a few points in doing it. Prescott had a real, what I would say is a nice road win, and going to Osceola and knocking them off. So Prescott, even though they're 2-2, I think they're finding their form, as I think you and I both expected them to. And when it comes to BW, obviously we'll see tomorrow night, where they shake out against another good team in Ellsworth. But I mean, Ellsworth has a legitimate scorer, right? Like Molly Janke goes into the game, and average. The reason that people pay attention to averages it's what you should expect a player to do, right? So we should expect Molly Janke to score 20 points at least, right?
Yep.
BW has not proven to have that threat, and it hasn't always been necessary. They were very competitive last year, and obviously they aspire to be more than competitive this year. They aspire to be atop that conference. But we'll talk about this with the boys as well. Is it going to be a BW team that kind of relies solely on defense, and then offense will come as it will organically, or is there going to be a score that emerges? And you've watched more of the girls' hoops this winter than I have, but I think there's a few elements to BW's starting five that maybe have it in them to be a 15 points a night player. I'm just not sure if or when that's going to happen.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily expect that to happen, just because that's not how this group of seniors has worked, right? They've always been very balanced, where any of them are capable of scoring double figures. The issue is that we've got to the point that we are not necessarily that it's an issue, because we do defend well, but we're not scoring a ton. The issue becomes that we don't have anybody that is consistently getting even close to double figures. Stella Com is probably at this point our leading scorer. And she's had, some 8-9 point games. She comes off the bench. What we've seen a lot of teams do thus far is play zone, and we haven't been real strong from the perimeter. And I don't know that that's necessarily an indictment on any of the players. It's just, it's taking some time to kind of figure out how we want to attack the zone, what we need to do well at first to soften up things to make it easier to score after that. Now, I think Brooke Klatt's gone off on some, kind of scoring runs on her own, and it's possible that she's a leading scorer. I didn't even bother to look if our stats were up because I know that they hadn't been.
They're not. I don't see a ton of. Yeah. So there's some, but not. I don't believe it's all of them.
So I think, because the game that is I think the first game.
Yeah.
But there are girls that have the potential to do it. I tell everybody, I think Maddie Jensen's a really skilled basketball player. And then when that translates to some points, I don't know. She had a run where she scored like on 3 consecutive possessions one game. And she's really skilled when she gets the ball at the high post. But just working that short corner to high post with her and Anna, it hasn't been super smooth. I think that's really just trying to get back in the flow of basketball, because all these girls play so many sports and they keep so busy that it's almost like relearning the game. And obviously with a new head coach, you have to really learn the intricacies of what she wants you to do in a zone, because it's probably different than what you did before. So, long question longer. There are girls that can do it. I don't know that it's necessarily got to be a single girl. It could be any girl on any given night. But we got to just do it well enough to come away with a win. And tomorrow, assuming the weather holds up, is going to be the first big test. But I also can tell you, I don't know that Molly Jenke's seen a defender like she'll see tomorrow. And I don't think it'll be Marnie because of the height difference. It could be Brooke a little bit. It could be Anna just to try to knock her around physically. But I think Haley Jort matches up with her pretty well. She's going to be able to do what Molly does from a speed perspective, match that. The great advantage that Jenke has is that she's significantly taller, right? And she still has the speed and the quickness. And that's why she's as good as she is. I mean, she's not just scoring, she's filling out the box score. I mean, she's almost 50% from the field. She shot 37 free throws in 4 games. So she's obviously doing her thing around the basket. Not shooting free throws great. If you want to pick apart her game, she's shooting 59.5%, which isn't great. But she's shooting free throws or 3-pointers at almost a 50% clip. So really pick your poison, and she's going to go out and get 12 boards. It's like, whoa. I think what I would do is I would try to attack her early and see if you can pick up a couple cheap ones and tell the girls, hey, if she wants to get to the rack, fine. Just wall up. Like, you're not going to block her. Don't even try to block her. Just wall up and see if you can take one. Because I think obviously as Ellsworth goes, she goes. As she goes, Ellsworth goes. And if she's sitting on the bench, nobody's going anywhere. So, it'll be really interesting to see how that all plays out tomorrow night.
Yeah. So, I mean, moving forward with the girls, I think tomorrow night's a big deal. These conference rundowns that we'll do throughout the season, it's early, like you mentioned. So it's hard to know how legitimate any of the standings really feel or how they should feel. And that's why it's really not too big of a deal right now. Right now, I think we're just trying to feel the conference out and see who will emerge. I think Altoona's got a real chance still. I think BW's got a real chance. Ellsworth, Osceola, whoever, it's any given night. And I think Somerset's going to play better. I think they're going to reemerge. I think that Lesh is too good. I think they've got too much length and height. I mean, they gave BW some real problems defensively with that height, with that length. And, it's going to be a fun year, as we thought it would be for them. But transitioning to the boys side, we've watched the BW boys. You were at one of their games. I was at both of their home games. You watched a good bit of that game that you weren't at when they played St. Croix Central. Obviously, neither of us were at Luck. But we can start with them because, I mean, that's kind of where that's where our feet are, and that's where we maybe know we have our most accurate takes maybe. But I think something that, me and you talked about in the preview, offensively, who could be their go-to weapon, right? Who could be their guy? And people will say, it's an unfair scheduling thing, or, it's just a tough luck of the draw when it comes to, obviously playing Prescott and St. Croix Central back to back, coming off of luck, which is not a strong team. But it's been a really good litmus test for what happens when you play against teams that have high level defense, right? St. Croix Central, they have seemingly, not skipped a beat from last year, defensively at least, right? They did a really nice job. Colin Hackworth is an elite defender. He's a high level defender. Carson Hinsman is a high level post defender, right? A little bit prone to foul trouble. And we'll talk a little bit more about Prescott, but staying on that BWSCC game, having the last 16 minutes of regulation and overtime result in 4 points for your team. It's, there's obviously bad bounces in there. I don't think that's an indication that of the player's talent. I don't think it's an indication necessarily of, the coaching staff or of what BW will do. But BW is also in the bonus for all 16 of those minutes, right? And they didn't shoot free throw, or didn't make a free throw, rather. I can't remember if they shot a free throw, to be honest. But it's an interesting thing, right? Because regardless if it's fair or not to play the two of the top four probably teams to finish this year, and I think BW is one of the top 4 teams that will finish this year in the MBC. It's against Prescott. Prescott had some their talent performed at a high level scoring the basketball, and obviously BW held them to in the 60s, which Prescott hasn't even been close to the 60s outside of those games, right? Or outside of that game, right? Prescott's been in the 80s and 90s, but and that's a testament to Baldwin Woodville. And haven't mentioned their defense. It's a special coaching job and ability by those players, the defense that they are playing. But offensively, especially with the speed at which they play, with the kind of the methodology of their offensive strategy, it'll be interesting going forward what's going to be the progression with them offensively, because to win at a high level, it's hard, and it's been proven hard. This is not my opinion, but the history of basketball, to win at a high level without the ability, to score at a high level.
Right. And I think the part that's going to help a little bit is the game against Luck. Because they scored so many points, is kind of set, not necessarily set the timeline back. If you play if you eliminate that Luck game where you scored 83 and look and say, okay, we scored 47, we scored 43, then you wonder. But I think, mentally, because that you had a game where you did score that amount, I think that helps, and I think that's similar to, kind of some conversations that we had about football, because the schedule was so tough early, right? And in football, it's even more of a big deal, because if you lose a couple of games that you shouldn't, you miss the playoffs, and that's determined early. In basketball, it's just about peaking at the right time. And so 47 against Prescott, 43 against Central in an overtime game. But it's not that they don't have guys that can score, right? I think, ultimately, when we, if you said, give me what you truly think, I think Keegan's going to be a double digit scorer, by average throughout the course of the year. I think, he's going to continue to improve from the perimeter and be the guy we saw last year. And he's going to start adding more of that post stuff that we know that he's had, that hasn't really been evident the last year and a half. I think Colin's going to be a double figure scorer, and really just kind of how does he find his way in the offense and how that works. Too skilled not to be a scorer, in my opinion. Eli's only going to get better, right? He's only going to get better. Cam is going to be right up there too. And so if you have four guys, which I think all four of those guys can be either double figure scores or near double figure scores, you're looking at 40 a game right there.
Right.
And I think, before you panic on 47 and 43, if those four guys combine for 40, you play other dudes. Sean Zomer can get you 6 or 8, right? Mason Werner is going to knock shots down from the perimeter. James Borkhardt is a pure shooter, and he's going to get you a handful. Sam Hush and Cale Locke are capable of scoring points. And that's, having coached for 3 years without having that guy that you can just look at and say, okay, you need to get us a basket. Guys start to figure that out, and I think the absence of Dylan Carroll, Dylan was that guy last year. And it's not that he was getting 25, but if you needed a basket, you look to Dylan and you'd say, well, he's going to take that shot, right? The game against Prescott, I'm pretty sure that was designed for him to get that shot. He didn't. He gave it up. He gave it to Cam. Cam gave it to Keegan. Keegan made the shot. But watching the end of the Central game on my phone and the timeout, 39-39 or 41-41, whatever the score was, I'm like, who's going to take the shot? And Keegan took a shot, and I don't know that it was necessarily what was designed, but that's more, you got to, what's the pecking order is more where I have questions. I'm not concerned about the scoring as much, I don't think, because I know we can guard, but it's when you're in the huddle, if you have 5 guys looking at each other wondering who's going to take that shot, that's not ideal, right? And so I'm curious to see who that guy's going to be, because I think they can all score, but who wants to be the alpha?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question, and on the flip side of my coin, which, being critical of the offense, it's not an indictment on necessarily the coaching staff or the players, or even the circumstance. It's just, it's been a combination of a lot of variables that, being 1-2 and 0-2 in conference is not, where any BW fan or that, of course, any of these players or coaches looking at the first 3 games wanted to be. But I think especially with a team with some seasoned players on it, it's very valuable to have a couple gut checks early. Right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I think it's infinitely more valuable than if they would have played 2 teams that, after luck, that, they put up 70 or 80 and think, we've got the most potent offense we could possibly have, right?
Yep.
Because this week of practice, into next Tuesday with, at Amory, I think they're going to win that game. I think they're going to win it handily. But it's given them a ton to think about and a ton to work on. And that's the point of practice, right? That's the point of not just showing up for games, is because you have a lot of time, especially early in the basketball season. Obviously the first couple of weeks where you don't play other than like a scrimmage, but you have a lot of time, in some of these week stretches where you can say, okay, here are our flaws. Here's what we're not executing. We need to execute. And the reason we're talking so much about BW is because this is a team that could win the Middle Border Conference. A 2-loss Middle Border Conference champion is not even close to unprecedented. It happens all the time. What rarely happens is what happened last year, right? Where even Prescott, going at the undefeated championships they've had, or last year obviously with Sacred Central going undefeated. That's a really rare thing on all levels of conference champion oriented basketball, right? High school and college. And so BW has everything on the table in front of them. I expect them to continue to get better. I expect them to become a unit offensively that can produce, for all the reasons you talked about. And defensively, they're going to be the best team in the conference, in my opinion. Defensively, they legitimately have an ability to be the best team in the conference defensively, and that's a huge deal, especially when you talk about peaking at the right time. Because if you can get that defense cooking early, and really iron out some of those wrinkles so that in late January, February, you can be a team that it's hard to get past 50 against. That's a really big deal. And along with BW, you know, a team that obviously hasn't started the way they want to because of a tough schedule is Ellsworth. Looking at Ellsworth, Prescott box score, obviously Ellsworth comes off the the top of the mountain, right? They get down to Madison and football, and they have you I think you'd agree with this. You've had a lot of exposure to middle border football is more than I have. One of the better teams the middle border's ever seen, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so they've got a lot of those guys coming on the basketball court, and they got it taken to them at home in front of all those fans that were at Camp Randall. They got it taken to them in a real way. The three-headed monster of Stewart, Wallen, and Malmlov at Prescott. They did a really nice job, as you'd expect them to. Janke had 22. He also took 20 shots, so that's to be expected. I don't think it's gonna be the last time Janke takes 20 shots. Schultz only having 6 is surprising.
Schultz only had 3.
Did he only have 3? So that's surprising. Is it surprising against Prescott? It's hard to say because Prescott's just such a well-coached unit, or group. But looking at Ellsworth, I think that they're a team that will finish in that top 4 as well. I think they're a team that, when Jack's right, especially against teams that don't have the defensive, because Prescott's that's a squad. They do not fall off. Their bench doesn't fall off. They are athletically, I would say their fourth most skilled player, Aiden Russell, is top 5 athlete in the conference, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Ellsworth, I think it's a good opportunity for them to, like we talked about with BW, look yourself in the mirror and say, what do we need to improve, right?
Yeah, and the thing about Ellsworth too is they didn't get the scrimmage. They didn't get. I mean, their football legs. It's really, it's hard to come off that season and meet Prescott right away. But I don't even think, if I'm an Ellsworth fan, if I'm an Ellsworth coach, you almost look at that as a scrimmage. Like, well, we're going to take lumps in game 1. Might as well take lumps against Prescott, right? They host Osceola tomorrow, weather, pending. Go to Central, which is going to be tough. Come to Baldwin-Woodville next Friday, which is going to be tough. And then they have an 11-day break, and it's Black River Falls and Edgar in a holiday tournament. And I think, that's going to kind of be coming into the new year where they get to play some non-conference games. They play Barron, they play Spring Valley, they play CFC. That's going to be the time where it's like, okay, let's get our foot on the gas. Let's get in basketball shape. And what's going to determine how good this team is how good those around Jack Janke are. And I think what they didn't have on, the game against Prescott was a lot of help around Jack, and they'll get that.
Yeah. And we mentioned Jack getting 22 against Prescott, or I did, like it was, just kind of water under the bridge. Like I can imagine that if you try to count the amount of players that have scored 20 on a Nick Johnson coach defense in the last 5 years, it's probably not a lot more than 2 hands, if it's even fills up 2 hands, right? You
Right.
just don't get that. And Jack had 22, wasn't efficient, which is okay because Jack just got done running over the middle border as a quarterback.
But it wasn't inefficient either. Like 8 for 20 is not great, but the way that I often look at it, like, oversimplifying things is, did you score more points than you took field goals? And because he's going to get to the free throw line so much, even if he shoots 8 for 20, which is 40%, he's 5 for 6 from the free throw line, right? So he's 22 points on 20 shots. Wallen was a super efficient 19 on 9 shots. Like, that's tough to do. Stewart was 17 on 13. Malmlov was 16 on 13. And so I don't, it's the other guys. Like, if Schultz is only scoring 3 points, he's taking 6 shots. that's not helping the cause. They had a number of guys that didn't score up to what they need. And so, I think having watched Prescott and then even going back to what you said about BW, scoring in the half court is hard. Like at any level that you watch, scoring in the half court is really hard unless one, you have range that you can just back up and take a shot in the half court, which we've seen Jordan Momlov do. Or if you have a guy that can isolate and get downhill into the rack, which we've seen Jack Janke do. Like their half court offenses are going to be okay because they have just default options that are going to work just fine. And Prescott, if Brandon Stewart continues to do what he does 3 for 5 the other night, if Dallas Wallen is the guy that scores 20, that makes half court offenses a whole lot easier, right? We got to see Parker and Doffing run that high pick and roll, and they didn't do it nearly as much as I would have thought they would. But that's kind of the, how efficient are you in the half court offense is really, to me, the big question. And the answer is often not very efficient. So then what do you do to, make it so you don't have to be? And a lot of the answer is we got to turn up the pace. And I think that's what Prescott's done. And if you can tire teams out, you're going to be more efficient in the half court because you're going to catch guys resting a little bit. So, I'm not down on Ellsworth. Let them, give them a couple weeks and see what happens. They've only played one game. Prescott, like we thought at the beginning, maybe a different level than the other teams. What you've watched more of the boys, so what are your takes for the teams we haven't yet talked about?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that me and you, we saw coming. I think that Altoona is taking their lumps. I think that, you were definitely right that, Osceola, it's going to be a journey for them. I watched that Altoona Osceola game, and Osceola jumped out to a really big lead at halftime, and they looked pretty good. It's one of those games where as a fan that's watched basketball in the middle border for the last 20 years now, both Altoona and Osceola are not teams that you go, wow, that's a put together team, right? They're both teams where you go, wow, at times and say, that's a piece that could add to the puzzle. I don't expect either of them to work their way into the top two, but they are both entirely capable of knocking somebody off in that top tier echelon. Somerset's an interesting team because I don't know how, they do a really nice job of this, but scheduling a bunch of games early, like they just get games,
yep,
right?
Every year.
And so they played 5, they're 4-1 overall. Their strength of schedule isn't the steepest, but they have a nice win over Altoona, which is legit. That's a quality win to pick up. And obviously they beat up on Amory. And, we really won't talk about Amory because I don't have any really good takes in them. They are what we kind of thought they'd be, right? They're going to have a long road of culture building, of team building. And it's just what's going to happen, right? And that's okay. Like I talked about with Central with the girls, that's okay. That's a part of the process. That you're going to find programs throughout the state, pretty much every school where there's a low point, and I think they might be at one. But back to Somerset, what's going to prove to me that they are a team that could come back to that top 4. Obviously last year it's finishing in the top 4, and they did for a couple of years in a row there, but behind Ortiz and behind, a number of other, those other pieces. What's going to prove to me is if they can score, if they can produce against a BW, a St. Clair Central, a Prescott, right? If they can produce against Ellsworth, and that's to be seen. And but a really an interesting team to me right now is St. Clair Central. I can't tell you how impressed I was by some of their pieces against BW. I think that Carson Hinsman is a legit top 10 impact player in the conference. Whereas I didn't know that he would be both ends of the floor impactful at the level that he is. He has footwork in the post. And this is a testament to his offensive line ability as well. But he has footwork that is really hard to find. He's light on his feet. He's soft on his feet. He doesn't travel, even though he gets to touch the ball all the time. And he also does it with tact. He's not bowling over people like he was as a sophomore and junior, right? He's not just throwing his elbow or throwing, not in a dirty way. He never did. I never saw him do that, but in the sense of just where he was like, well, I'm stronger, so I'll just move you, right? It didn't seem like he was doing that. It was a strategic, it was a thought out, using his balance, using his weight effectively. And I was really impressed with that. I was also very impressed with Colin Hackbarth adjusting to a point guard role, because, and you can talk about this because you game plan for Colin for a couple of years, from really for definitely obviously his sophomore year. But he's a guy that when he's on the wing as a catch and shoot 3-point shooter, he's in the top 10 for the last 10 years at least, in the middle border period. Like, he catches it and he has a good look from three. There's a 50-50 chance it's going in at least.
Right.
And that's a really, really strong skill set. And to kind of take that and say, you know what, I'm going to put this on the shelf for a little bit. I'm going to be the leader of this team. I'm going to bring the ball up like Gabe Seiler did so effectively for 3 years, and distribute, because Colin it was apparent that he was looking to distribute. He was looking to get his teammates involved. And the BWSAC game, not to go into too deeply, but there were times where guys got looks for Central that otherwise wouldn't have gotten a look if, Hackbarth just goes, I'm more skilled, I'm going to try to take to the rack. And he did that late, where he had some possessions where it was like, yeah, Colin knew they needed a bucket. But they've really proved me wrong. Coach Hayes has really proved me wrong in the sense that they haven't fallen off, in my opinion, nearly where I thought they would fall off, right? I think that they've got a couple pieces that they've added that are really fitting in nicely, and they're a legitimate threat at the top. I don't know, I'd love to hear your take on Prescott, where they're at now, but I don't know if they're a legit threat to Prescott per se. I think that the 3-headed monster, 4-headed monster, 5-headed monster some nights of Prescott and their starting five is really tough, but really impressed with the Panthers.
Yeah, I mean, you and I talked about it before, not necessarily here, but you take Gabe Seiler off of the floor for really the first time in 4 years and have anybody else do it, it's got to be different, right? He was such a complete player that made everybody better, defended, emotional leader, but all the playmaking started and ended with Gabe. And when he wasn't necessarily the playmaker, he was off the ball, but you still had to account for Gabe Seiler, right? And Colin Hackbarth is not that same player, but not necessarily because he doesn't have the ability, but because he hasn't proven that he can do it. He certainly may be able to, but Gabe Seiler was not the shooter that Colin Hackbarth was, right? And Carson Hinsman is something that no team has, right? He's not a D1 basketball player, but he's a D1 athlete who is bigger and stronger than literally everybody else he'll play. And so when you have an elite shooter and you have a dominant post presence, your team's going to be okay. What it's missing is that true number one. And so when you try to take one of those other guys and make him into that, it may not always work. But there might be nights where Colin is both of those and does just fine. And could that be a threat to the Prescott Cardinals? Sure. I mean, I think the gap is not as wide as it was the year that Central beat Prescott at Central 2 years ago.
Right.
And so to say that they can't do it, that's not fair, because we watched it happen in a really good game 2 years ago, where the Prescott, if the season doesn't get shut down, maybe makes a run to the Kohl Center, right? So But I don't think it's fair to say that Ellsworth couldn't do it on the right night. I don't think it's fair to say that Baldwin Woodville couldn't do it on the right night. Um, could Somerset do it on the right night? Maybe. Could Altoona do it if teams sleep on them? Yeah, I think Evan Peterson's better than what he's been so far, and they have a 6'6" junior that almost averages double figures. Um, but just the combination of having those two, and then you add in length in Whitaker, Nielsen, like there's stuff there. There's a reason that their JV's been really good forever, and so I'm not going to say that Central's going to take second place in the conference, um, or that they're not going to take first place. I just think that there's a lot of questions that are still really good questions at this point in time, and we got to see how everything plays out. And um, so far, I don't think there's been any real big surprises. The teams that have a 2-0 record, they were the team that we thought was maybe going to be the better team at the beginning of the year. Um, Amory at 0-2 and BW at 0-2, those are different from each other in that one of them played Prescott Central and one of them didn't. Right.
Right.
And so there's still a lot to be answered. But um, Jack Janke getting 22 in his first night, I think that's kind of the way that they're headed. Um, I am curious because you didn't say much about Osceola. Well, what did they do the game you watched them?
Yeah, well, you talked about it in the preview, but they obviously have not had a lot of success for the better part of 5 years. And they've had they had some a couple of years ago, but for the last couple of years they've had some young guys that have had to step up with some older players that just weren't good enough to compete in the middle border, right? To compete at a high level. And what it looked like to me, and they played 11. They might have played 12 guys in the first half. I didn't watch the whole game all the way through. But I think their coach is trying to figure out who they are. I know their coach from he was the C team coach there when I was the C team coach there, and I coached against them. And he's a really good dude. He's a really smart guy. He coached all these kids when they were freshmen. And the same kind of players are showing up. The Charlie's valuable player both ends of the floor. Slater is a really valuable player both ends of the floor. They've got a big man that is not the smoothest athlete, but is very impactful, especially defensively and offensively in the offensive boards and kind of putbacks. I don't know that there's a ton of, like we talked about with BW and Ellsworth, or not Ellsworth rather, but Sacred Central. If there's going to be necessarily a guy that emerges as an 18-point a night guy, but I don't know that will have to happen, right? It's similar in their football season, right? And obviously they hit the ground running in football, but their offense on the football field has never been about, well, this guy's going to get 1,800 yards on the ground and everybody else is going to block and cheer, right? They run an offense where it's predicated on sometimes it's this guy, sometimes it's that guy, sometimes it's that guy, etc. Okay. And so you talk about that at the basketball court, and obviously basketball being the specific skill set oriented, it'll be interesting. And it's going to be interesting the same way that watching Altoona, it was a much different looking team in the sense of physically, right? Osceola walks onto the basketball court and you're like, tough. Like that's a big, strong group because they are, right? Altoona, it looks a little bit more like a basketball school, which it has been, right? It's been a basketball school. A lot of those kids, obviously, they play basketball quite a bit. And I think, like you said, I think that, was it Evan Peterson? I think he's going to be a guy that emerges as, like you said in the preview, one of the conference's better scorers. I think that it might be right now for Altoona where Peterson gets the ball and he looks over and he's like, okay, there's no Turk, there's no Keisha. Like, it's right. Like, where are all these dudes that I filled it up with for the last couple of years, right? And that's real. And we talked about that preview. So yeah, I mean, Osceola or Altoona and Somerset, I kind of put those three together right now as teams where I I don't know how it's going to shake out. I think I do have some feeling about that, but I don't know. A team that I definitely do know is Prescott, right? I definitely know where I stand with them.
Yep.
They like, it's not hyperbole. It's not an overstatement or an exaggeration to say they have three guys that are capable of taking over a game.
Mhm.
Dallas Wallen, when Malmov was, on the bench to start the second half, and even when Malmov was on the floor, Dallas Wallen would do things, attacking the basket, being a 6'4" kid that's probably going to end up being 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", where you're like, okay, that's unguardable. Like
Mhm.
that's not something that a high school kid. And I say that from the sense of like he playing against BW, you've got a really good defense that you're playing up against, and he would just pick possessions where he's like, I'm gonna not only take it to the rack, I'm gonna take it to the rack via the lane, and I'm
Mhm.
not left-handed. I'm gonna start on the right wing as a right-handed player, cross over to my left, and then take it up and be at the level of the hoop, right? And then you've got Jordan Malmov, whose range is similar to Trae Young in the sense of when he rises up from 30 feet, it's not like, why is he doing that? It's like, oh yeah, he does that, right? And then so you've got that, and then you've obviously got the newcomer, right? And so it's with your role players being guys at the level of Ben Roll and Aiden Russell, and then having a Severson who's a really nice piece off the bench. Um, it's like you said, it's tough not to think that there's a gap right now. But what did you think of them watching them, the other night in BW?
Well, they're a really good team. I mean, there's not a lot of, or any glaring weaknesses. They're they're solid right now. And the only thing that you wonder is, and they've done it in the past, so you wonder less. How does a high possession team, fast paced, up tempo team, how does that translate to the big games in March? Because it's hard to do that against really, really good teams. And so that's the only thing you wonder. But they've had success doing it in the past. And BW slowed the pace down. Prescott still played well. So, um, I was impressed by how they played. And I think they have they certainly are the favorite, and they have a chance to make some noise as the season progresses. Looking ahead kind of at what this conference has to offer for the next, 7 or 8 days. Osceola Ellsworth tomorrow at Ellsworth. I think I feel like Ellsworth's the superior team there, especially at their gym. And then this weekend, actually, Central will host Hayward, Prescott will host Regis, and Elk Mound will host Altoona. So three non-conference games. Then conference slate on Tuesday is full. BW at Amory, Somerset at Osceola. Altoona makes the long drive to Prescott, which could be a longer drive home. And then Ellsworth SEC, which I think is going to that'll be a fun one. And then two more games on Thursday, both non-conference. St. Croix Falls hosts Somerset, Unity hosts Osceola, and then a full conference slate on Friday. So it'll be interesting for Somerset and Osceola. Actually, not a full conference slate. Amory hosts Altoona, BW hosts Ellsworth, Somerset hosts Prescott, and Central makes the long drive to Poplar to play the Northwestern Tigers.
Yeah, a lot to look forward to, both boys and girls hoops. Obviously, a little bit of rebranding. We, changed from Western Wisconsin Sports Podcast to, Baseline to Baseline. And I think the reason for that is, we're going to be mostly predicated on, the middle border. We know it the best. If we get opportunities to talk to coaches from other conferences or work with other coaches from other conferences who have really good, knowledgeable takes from those conferences, we're more than willing, and we're more than happy to, and hopefully will come about and be exciting. So thanks for all that have joined. Hopefully we'll see you guys tomorrow night on the stream as BW hosts Ellsworth girls, and then next week as BW hosts Ellsworth boys. So it's been a lot of fun. It's early. It's a lot of fun to think about the questions we have going forward, but this has been Baseline to Baseline. Thanks.
So long.